Hi there, I'm Maria Piper, Director of Programs at OnRamp, and I'm really excited that you're joining me today. This is all about how to help you achieve success in your job hunt, whether that's at OnRamp in one of our apprenticeship programs or in your regular job search. And one of the key parts of any job search, even at OnRamp, is your resume. So this is all about best practices that I have learned, that I have researched, and that I have seen on both sides of the hiring process. I want to help set you up for success, both in this job search that you're going on right now and any future ones. So, one question that I think a lot of us have on our mind, especially as we're trying to move into technical fields where it might be less important to have a resume than something like a portfolio, for instance. But resumes still matter. And if you're applying to an apprenticeship through OnRamp, it's quite likely that you are coming from a non-traditional background. And when we say non-traditional, we mean that you might have gotten your education anywhere other than a traditional 4-year program. So you might have a history. I actually have a master's in history, which doesn't really lend itself to computer science super well. You might have a bachelor's in English. You might have a community college degree in something completely different than computer science, or you might have one in computer science. You might have attended a boot camp. You might have just taught yourself online. Any of those things are like if you got your background and your education in computer science and software engineering in any of those ways, you are a non-traditional applicant. A traditional applicant is somebody who has a 4-year computer science or closely related degree. And for those of us who are non-traditional, it is really important to have a compelling resume. Why? Because a good resume can tell the reviewer about your work accomplishments, whether they are related to a software engineering or technology job or not. They also make connections for the person who's reviewing your resume between your past experiences and the job you're applying for. And that's a lot of work that you have to do in writing a good resume. And it also will help you demonstrate why you could do the job based on your education or past accomplishments. That's a lot for a one piece of paper to do, but it's super important that you do a lot of work to make sure your resume is as compelling as possible. In my own experience looking at resumes, I probably spent maximum, and this is being generous, 1 minute per resume. That means that I am quickly scanning through and saying, okay, what kind of background does this person have? I have the job requirements from the hiring manager, and I'm like, how does this mesh? If a person is a non-traditional, has a non-traditional background, it's going to be harder for me to make those connections unless a person has explicitly worked hard to make those connections for me. I'm not going to take the time when I have, 50 resumes to review to like sit there and be like, well, I think this person's experience in this job up here when they were a salesperson is really tied to how they can take user input from a team and then make decisions based on that. I won't have time to do that. So that's actually work that you have to do. So, especially for non traditional people, resumes are important. And because they are so important, it's important that you take some time to do it. Now, to be fair, at OnRamp, resumes are not the most important part of our application process. I am 100% confident in telling you that. But it still does help us understand where you're coming from, what educational experiences you have, if you've added anything that supplements your application with us. And ultimately, every company we work with wants a resume for their own applicant tracking system that they need for their documentation. So we need a resume regardless, and it's just helpful if it's a decent one. So let's go into some best practices because I don't know about you, but I never got a class in how to write a compelling resume. As a funny little anecdote, I thought I had a great resume and went to college. I was a senior, and as part of one class, our professor was like, okay, you need to give me your resume as part of your work to get into this class, because it was an incredibly popular class. So I was like, well, at least I have work experience. And so I put my resume in there. And basically, when he got everyone's resume, he's like, all of your resumes are terrible. You should actually spend like 30 minutes at least per bullet writing it out. And I was just like, I have to do what? Spend how much time? But, that was just like that wake up call I needed to know that actually writing a good resume takes a lot of work. And it's totally panned out for me. I have spent a lot of time writing resumes, rewriting bullets, trying to make things as personal as possible. So, with that said, let's move on. What are the best practices that will help you get further in any hiring process? The first one is simple. Just use the normal, boring template that you see here. I say this because there are a ton of really beautiful resume templates out there, but you never know exactly what a person's looking for, and reviewers are used to looking at this. Plus, you're just a software engineer, you're not a designer. They don't expect you to have the most beautiful resume in the world. If you are a designer and you're applying for design jobs, disregard this. You should probably have something that showcases your design abilities. But if you're just a software engineer or like looking for software engineering jobs, you can get away with using the normal boring template. So just do it. With very few exceptions, your resume should be one page only. Now, there is a rule that if you can have one page for every decade of experience, but especially if you're changing careers, you probably won't have enough to really justify 2 pages. Everything on your resume should be tailored to the job you're applying for, not telling them about a bunch of unrelated stuff, because you really want to make it as easy as possible. When you're writing your resume, think about, how can I make this as easy as possible for the person to imagine me in the job? So if there is a really great thing that you did that does not at all apply and you can't find a way to make it work, just take it out. If you can't take out like a couple years of experience or a job because it'll put a gap in your resume, but it's a pretty self-explanatory job title, because let's say I was a teacher. So in my resume, I don't include any like bullets about what it means to be a teacher, because everyone knows what it means to be a teacher. If you have something like that for like customer success or customer service or something like that, you can include it just as like a line item that's like, I was a customer service representative for this amount of time. People can ask you about it, but they don't need to go into the details of what your job experience was if it's unrelated. If you find the normal boring template to be too boring, I think it's totally fine if you want to add a color or a custom font, but don't go overboard. Don't add more than one color. Don't add more than 2 fonts. If you have 2 fonts even, it might be too much. But the way to do that properly would be to like make your titles or like headings one font and the text another font. You just don't want it to be like clashing. Make sure everything works together really nicely. You can have 2 colors, I guess, if one is a neutral. Like instead of using black, you could use like a dark gray, if that just makes you feel better. So don't go too nuts. Another one that actually is probably just one of my big pet peeves, but I have heard this from other people who are hiring as well, is that you should not submit anything other than a PDF for your resume. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that a PDF actually saves everything that, like all the design choices you have made will go out to the person. It also is polished. It's not editable. So I don't know, for me at least, it was frustrating to get something that wasn't a PDF, because a lot of times people send me Word docs, and I've worked at places where I don't have access to Microsoft Word. So it comes in as either like a text file, or I have to open it in Pages, and then it looks completely different. If a person used a custom font, it gets completely reinterpreted. It's just not a great way to like make that experience as easy as possible. It's just far easier to do PDF. So just do a PDF. It also just all feels weird to me if I have the ability to edit your resume. because that's not really what I'm there to do. I'm just there to revise your resume. I'm not going to take notes in your resume. I'm just going to read it. At OnRamp and at other companies, you are going to hit file size issues. So at OnRamp, ours is 500 kilobytes, but most resumes, especially if you're following this template, do not need to be very big. They probably won't even hit 500 kilobytes. One of the things that is an absolute no-no in a resume is a picture. If you're applying to a job in the United States, you should not include a picture on your resume. A picture is going to be one of those things that makes your file larger. So guess what? Take it out and you don't have to worry about it. Now, another key thing is to maintain white space. If you look at the resume here, you'll see that there is quite a bit of white space, but not too much. I have seen resumes that have like hardly any text and are mostly white space. Avoid that too, because it just doesn't give any information to the person who's looking at it. But also, avoid having your page just look like a block of text that a person's going to have to like sit there and read, because no one wants to do that. The whole point of a resume is to make things as easy as possible for a person to skim, to make those connections they need to decide you're a good person for the role. And another key thing is to use readable font sizes. So you don't know, you can't assume if a person is going to be reading a resume on a computer, a large monitor, an iPad, or a tablet, or a small phone. So if they're going to be reading on any of these things, you don't want to make it really hard for them. So don't go any smaller than 10 pixels for your font sizes. Just make sure that they can read it. Next, you always want to make sure you include the following sections. And this is especially true for a software engineering role. Some of these you can take out if you are not looking for software engineering. But the main thing here, you always need to have your profile information. So like your name, phone number, email, GitHub, or a portfolio link your LinkedIn, and your region. Now I say region, not necessarily the city, not your address. Don't include your address. No one is going to mail you a rejection or acceptance. So addresses are completely obsolete. You don't need them anymore. And in fact, I think they can hurt more than they can help you. Now I say region. Region could be like if you're applying to the San Francisco Bay Area, saying San Francisco Bay Area, or Denver, Colorado, like city. If you're looking at a place that's not as much of a metropolitan area, you can say, like Denver, Colorado, Austin, Texas, etc. But I would say that if you are trying to move for a job, so if you are not currently in the location in which you are applying, you can just take out the region. And I say that because a lot of companies, especially smaller companies or companies that aren't interested in offering relocation, are simply not going to look at your resume. They're just going to throw it out. Again, this is more of a not on-ramp type of advice here because we don't care as much about region, but we also don't typically offer relocation for our opportunities. So that means like if you're in a different place, that's great, but you're going to have to pay to come to the location that you're applying for if you're given if you accepted. A lot of other companies just won't even consider you. They'll be like, oh, it's just too much work for me to try to arrange travel, if I'm even going to arrange travel, or to trust that a person's going to get on a plane. And at least at one company I worked at, people had accepted job offers and then they just completely bailed the day they were supposed to show up. So they were like, okay, we're not taking anyone who isn't from the area anymore because they're not serious. So if you are trying to move, I would suggest taking out your region, or if you feel like you need to include it for honesty, put down somewhere, maybe include a summary section, which is not included as a necessary component of resumes in my mind, that you are like excited about relocating. So that's one way of trying to get around that bias. Work experience, you'll always want to include some work experience if you have it. If you have no work experience, you can disregard. Projects. So if you are applying for a software engineering role, and especially if you come from a non-traditional background, you should have a few finished, polished projects, and you should include links to the source code and any like audience facing or public facing site. So you want them to be able to like look at both the code you did and what is actually visible to people or usable to a user. And you don't need to include a ton, just include your best ones. Skills are really important. We'll talk about which skills to include a little bit later, but make sure you're at least including the skills referenced in the job description. That is really important, especially like language and the technology stacks. And then education. So, typically we think about the education section just being like college or university, but you can also include things that are like informal certificates. If you took a MOOC like from Udemy or got any kind of like online class, put those things in if they're relevant to the job you're applying for. Going back to one of the earlier things, you want to make as many connections as possible. So include anything that is relevant to your job description. So if you took like, a 4-week class online from like, I don't know, I took one on R, for instance, I should include that if R is important for the job I'm applying for. Next. This is the really key thing. And it's also the one that takes a lot of time. So you need to customize each resume that you send. Again, this is especially true if you have a non-traditional background, but it's also true if you have like a regular CS degree, because not every job is looking for the same thing. Some companies value certain skills, certain traits over others. And you don't want to send like a boilerplate thing that shows that you actually didn't care enough to make a few adjustments to your resume to make those connections as easy as possible for the reviewer. Now, another caveat here is that large companies like Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon, these kinds of companies they won't have a person read your resume first. They're going to send it through their ATS, which is going to use some sort of algorithm to figure out if you have enough of the match to even move forward. I think the one way to bypass that is to actually get a referral to those companies. So that might be a way forward. But unless you're applying to one of those, you'll need to actually customize the resume, because a person is going to look at it and a person is going to have to make those connections between the job description, and they're going to be most familiar with that job description. They're not going to be familiar with whatever job description you use to make one template or one resume. So this is where a lot of the work comes in. You need to read that job description as well as possible. Possibly also use any other sites you can, like the career website, to look up any like key values that the company has, or like figure out what the current projects they're working on, or what is it that's compelling them right now, or what is their business necessity right now. You can use all of that information to determine what the company is looking for. And then you need to figure out what experience you have that matches what they're looking for. So, if your last job was a customer service representative at, I don't know, the electronics section of a Target, what are the things that are similar to that job as the one you're applying for? And some of those things could be like, actively listening to customers to determine what their needs are, assess their needs, and then make recommendations based on that. That is pretty common, like a pretty common skill that most software engineers need. So that's just a way of like translating that experience. So you need to go through that exercise and be like, what are all the things I did in that job, and how does it relate to the job that I'm actually applying for here, and what the company is looking for in particular. Now, if you have experience in that company's industry, that's really cool to highlight. So if you were a nurse or did something in healthcare and you're applying to a company in health tech, then you can use that experience and like highlight that in your resume. That's pretty cool. It shows that you can bring kind of the customer mentality to the team, which is really helpful. Another really key thing is when you're thinking especially about your past work experience or awards or anything like that, you want as many like pieces of data to back up why you will be successful in this role. So for instance, if you ever got Employee of the Month, which is kind of like a weird, outdated-ish thing these days, but if you got that award, like what was it you think that got you that award? What part of your job performance was it? Is it related at all, or can it be related to the job you're applying for? Make sure you, if it can, make sure you include that information. Even with, if I'm thinking about, I used to work at Office Max as a high school student. So what are the things that I could highlight there? I could highlight that, you know, in my spare time, I worked as the cashier. Like I sold, you know, on any given day, like $500 to $2,000 worth of electronics that was supplementary to my key job. You know, I like successfully added on, you know, increase the sale by X% because I used to try to get a lot of people to do like little add-ons for cool paperweights and things like that. I was really into office supplies. So anyway, thinking about those kinds of things, it should be truthful, but it's unlikely. You know, for instance, like I don't have any data to back up like exactly how much I increased sales. But if I did have a decent idea or could like guesstimate as closely as I could to something that's real there, that's something you can include. I think it goes without saying, but I should harp on it a little bit here, that your resume should be truthful. You should not put any information on here that you don't want to be questioned on or you don't want someone to ask about. And you should be able to show to some degree that this is true. So, you know, it'd probably be a little bit difficult for me to like go back and find any data from Office Max in high school, but I don't think I would actually put any of that information on because it's just too old. But if I were looking at something from like the past few years, I would be able to provide like a reference who would be able to speak to it, or some other like person or information that could back up what I have on the resume. Resumes should not be a place to just like embellish because you're going to want to prove that you can do these things. So you can embellish a little, but don't embellish too much so that it's uncomfortable. You should be able to back up your claims. And then, you know, thinking also about this job description, if you're looking and you have a number of finished projects that you are comfortable sharing, pick the ones that are the most closely related to the job. So don't include all of them because people aren't going to look at all of them. They want you to tell them what to look at. So just pick one or two of the best examples of finished products that relate to this job. And if you don't have anything specifically related to this job, you have a couple of options. You can either work on something in the process of your application to show, or you can just include the most polished things that are like related enough for the job. And then lastly, you know, looking at the skills that are most important. So this is often in the like minimum requirements section or preferred qualifications. Like what are the technologies and tools they want you to use? So make sure that you are including a number of those, but you first need to assess which of those there are. So make sure you have a list of like, these are the most important things that they want. These are the things that I have. So this will probably be you don't have to write it down necessarily, but you should have all of these things in the back of your mind when you sit down to write your resume. And it's just incredibly important that you actually do this work so that you are sending out the best resume possible for the job. Next, now this is another like pet peeve section for me, but it's mainly about being consistent. So in your resume, you will have a bunch of bullets, more than likely. All of these bullets should begin with a compelling active verb. So you never start a sentence with I. You always start with a verb, or you can do like an adverb sometimes, like frequently, but I would actually avoid that for the most part. I would just say, like, if you did something that maintained something, if you built something, you transformed something, you innovated something. Any of these things are active verbs that capture people's attention. And again, looking at that job description, you can kind of figure out what verbs they're looking for because they put them down in the bullets for the most part, or in the job requirements. Another thing is that verb tense should be consistent throughout your experience section. So if you have present tense in one bullet, you should have present tense in all of your bullets. If you're using past tense instead, it should be past tense for all of your bullets. Even if you're currently working at a job and you chose past tense for all the past jobs because that made the most sense to you, your current experience should still be past tense. It's just easier for a person to read. It's easier to scan. Just be consistent. When you do tense switching, it just, without a person realizing it. So like if I'm reviewing a resume that does a lot of tense switching, it just feels sloppy because it's making me do work in the back, like in the back of my head that's like past, present, and I don't realize that I'm doing it, but it's likely that I'd be getting this feeling like this person is not as detail oriented as we need, or this person is sloppy. So the bit about consistency is all about making sure there are no red flags just in things that are really minor in your resume. So those are two key ones. Another one is to either have periods at all the end of your bullets or have no periods at the end of your bullets. Technically, if you're starting a bullet with a verb, you are not putting a full sentence, so you don't need a period. I personally like periods because it's just the way I'm used to writing. But again, it's about consistency. So if you have periods at the end of some and not at the end of others, it again looks sloppy. It might give the person who's reviewing it just one more reason to be like, meh, I don't think this person is a good fit for the job. And that's actually like such a silly reason to disqualify somebody, right? So just don't let people disqualify you for that. Another one is to just capitalize words consistently. So, GitHub can be spelled, for example, GITHUB all lowercase, or it can have camel case. Just make sure you're using it consistently. Also, make sure you're using a good, like, publicly facing spelling. A lot of people actually do like on-ramp, O-N capital R, where we don't do that anywhere. So like we're always lowercase r. So if you were going to talk about on-ramp, for instance, in your thing, don't have a capital R in your resume somewhere because that's not how we see ourselves. So just double check, especially in the day and age where letters are capitalized in all different places, that you're actually using a reliable and like that the company itself refers to itself that way. GitHub actually does refer to itself in both ways. And then if you do have a choice, make sure you're consistent. Double check your spelling. There are some cases where you can misspell something that's really important and other cases where it's not important, but it just looks sloppy. So one of the things that is important is definitely make sure you don't misspell your name or email address or mistype your phone number, because if they choose to like follow up with you later or interview you, they will have a harder time finding you. So just make sure that's all accurate. And then in terms of just making sure everything else is spelled properly, it again just goes to the sloppiness factor. Make sure, in this day and age, we have spell check for everything. So just make sure you do that final spell check because it's very easy to mistype an E or an I in the wrong order, etc. So again, don't give people reasons to expel your resume. And then be consistent with your text fonts and size. So if you're like really trying to get everything into that one page that we talked about earlier, and the only way to do it is to make your skills size 9 and your experience size 10, like you're going to need to take something out. Make sure that the text that you want people to read is the same size. So you can have headings be bigger. You can have certain things be bolded, or like titles. If you want the titles to be larger, you can do that, but just make sure it's consistent. Don't change like the body. In a lot of cases in a resume, it's going to be the bulleted section with the body of another section. Those should all be the same. All right, more best practices. This one is actually really key. So you want to focus on your accomplishments, not your job responsibilities. So if you're focusing, especially if you're trying to translate your experience and to show a track record of success, people don't need to know what job responsibilities you had. They need to know what you accomplished. So that's going to take a little bit of reframing what you did in your past job. You don't need to like basically find your past job description that you applied for and you got the job for and be like, okay, well, these are the bullets that they wanted. These are what I did. Just copy paste them over. No. That doesn't show that you actually did those things particularly well. It doesn't show that you can transfer that knowledge from one industry or one job to another. So you want something that is an accomplishment that shows that you have the ability to succeed. And ideally, it would be something that you could see that translates somehow into the job you're applying for. So this goes back to doing your research. If you did your research, you should have a really good sense of what experiences you should include in your resume for a job and which experiences you should not include for a job. So just as an example, for me, there was a time when I was applying for jobs in learning and development as well as HR. So when I applied for jobs in learning and development, I always included my teaching background because that was really important. It was part of the story there. But in HR, when I was applying to typical HR jobs, I was not including teaching stuff unless there was going to be a heavy teaching presentation component to the HR job itself. Otherwise, there's no point in me putting it in. So, make sure that you're paying attention to what they're looking for. That will help you figure out what's necessary and what's not necessary in your resume. So focus on what you achieved and include those metrics whenever possible. I talked about that a little bit before. If you can come up with any kind of indication of like how much you improved something, this is a really good thing to make sure you do before you quit any job, is to collect any data on how you, like what you succeeded on, or if you improved something a certain amount or you reduced the time to do a certain thing, like make sure you're keeping track of those things as you work, and that you have a copy of them so you can use them later in your job searches. But if you don't have that, you'll need to start from scratch and focus on your achievements and whatever metrics you can possibly use. The other one is to make connections between the past experience and this job opportunity. We've talked about that a little bit. But again, this is a lot of very individual work that you're going to need to do for every job and looking back at your experience. Make sure you're highlighting those accomplishments. So I don't know if you recall, you can go back to the earlier slide, but the slide with the resume that I included had key accomplishments under the bullets. That's useful. Otherwise, you can just try to focus all of your bullets on something you accomplished in that work that also gives an idea of the work you were doing. So for instance, I was at one point the director of diversity at a boot camp, and I built or I revamped the entire or I led the revamping and the redoing of our engineering empathy curriculum. So when I highlight the accomplishment there, I say I revamped the engineering empathy curriculum to reduce the to increase student satisfaction by X%, which I did have some data for, and instructor capacity and comfort in teaching the material by X%. So, revamping something I think is an accomplishment in and of itself, but showing that it actually had an outcome that was useful was also really important. And again, this goes back to making sure that you are actually able to find some metrics in your job experience that helps. And again, before I leave a job, I try to collect as much of those metrics as I possibly can. And I take those with me so that I have that knowledge for resumes and for future jobs. And then a key one is to just take some of those verbs from the job description to highlight your fit. So if they say they're looking for someone who can innovate, make sure you use innovate somewhere in your bullets if you've innovated. If you collaborated a lot with people, make sure you use collaborate, those kinds of things. They kind of give you a map to some degree in a job description of what they're looking for if they've written a good job description, which is a big if. So try to use those as much as possible because, again, this is all about helping the person who's reading your resume make the connections between how your experience matches what this one-page ideal candidate looks like. So you want to make it as easy as possible. Don't make them think too hard about how you could fit in this job. So I wanted to include a real life example. And I chose an apprenticeship because that's a lot of what OnRamp does, but this is a pretty warm and fuzzy job description that I found. So just as a caveat that this is unlikely to be exactly what you're going to find in a job. But if you were going to apply to this apprenticeship that I found on LinkedIn, here are the key things I bolded. The first set of bullets are going to be the most important here because it says, an apprenticeship is about learning. Learning is going to be key. We're seeking candidates who have the following requirements, but we know you're just getting your career started and we're committed to helping you learn and grow. If you've had some experience with coding or development in the past, you're exactly the type of candidate we're looking for. And then these things below, these 3 bullets here, these are how I'm interpreting these as requirements. These are the actual requirements for the job. You must have these. These are the minimum requirements. And then there's some knowledge or experience in one or more of the following. Those are preferred qualifications. So you should have one at a minimum, but they are not expecting you to have all of these. So when you are looking at what to highlight in your own job, you will want to highlight an interest in learning. So that could look like showing that you have done classes at a certain interval for the past few months or years, or that you have done a couple of different types of things to enhance your learning in software development. For most people who are making the transition to software development, it's not as hard to show that you're interested in learning because you have likely made a big shift. So just make sure you're highlighting that and you're not taking out any experience that you've relevant experience for these kinds of things. Problem solving skills. So this is one where if you think about your past experience and you're like, well, what were the problems that I was trying to solve? It's a little bit harder to do with projects because you're not likely going to, well, you could choose to put in a little summary of what the problem was and what you were trying to solve. That's useful. But in these problem solving skills, one of the things that they often want to see is how you problem solve with people. So if you have any experience that shows that you problem solved with others, that's helpful. But obviously you would like to have more than one example of how you are eager to learn, how you can have how you solve problems well, and how you communicate well. Another one, again, communication, really key. I don't think I've ever seen a resume or a job description that doesn't ask for someone with excellent communication skills. They don't usually define what excellent communication skills are, but you'll want to make sure you have some good backup from any kind of experience in your life that shows that you are a good communicator. And ultimately, your resume is one of the ways to show that you have good communication skills. If you follow all of these things, you're basically communicating with somebody via writing. So make sure that's another reason to make sure your resume is actually quite good. Ability to work independently. This is another huge one that's almost on every or every job description I've seen. People want those who don't need to be like watched over all of the time. So making sure that you can show that you did things by yourself. In this case, the job description also asks that you take initiative. So if you've ever led a project, that's super helpful to show. They will also want to see that you collaborate with others. So definitely make sure you include information about collaboration. And then, after you get all of those times you took initiative, collaboration, after you got that, then you can focus on those, like you need at least one of these things. So make sure that you include that information, but it's not the most important thing. If you go into this and you're like, okay, well, I can just ignore those top bullets and I need to get as many of those bottom bullets as possible, that's probably actually the wrong idea. They want the top bullets. That's a must. The bottom bullets is more nice to have, but a minimum of one. So make sure that you're focusing more of your effort on the top and then include the information at the bottom. And some of these things you can just include in the skills section. So if you have experience with Python or with Java, that can go in your skills or your project section versus actually being a bullet in your past work experience. Again, including any knowledge of agile principles. So if you have a group project that you're sharing or anything like that, you can say whether you used agile. You can put DevOps information. If you have like Travis Jenkins, JUnit, all of those tools, if you have any of that, you should just put it in the skills section, unless you have pretty significant experience with it. That's a way of actually making your resume a little bit more concise and also like making sure that you're covering everything here. But again, they don't expect you to have all of these things. So if you have like 3 different examples of problem solving skills, 4 of communication, 1 of taking initiative, 1 of working independently, 1 of collaborating, you're probably going to be in a better position for this job than if you met all of those bottom bullets. If you had like Python and design thinking and hypothesis-driven development and social coding, like those kinds of things, you actually really want to focus on the top, most important ones. All right, and that is the end of this presentation. So if you have any questions or want any follow-up information about resumes and best practices, you can find some in the training plan where this is a part of. We have, I think, like 5 different optional things that could help you with that. But also don't hesitate to reach out to us at support@onramp.io. We are happy to help and answer any individual questions, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. Sorry, I'm a little wordy and not as concise as I could be today. So thanks so much, and best of luck with your application and your job hunt. Have a great day.